Welcome to Uplink. The aviation dialogue starts here. I'm Shasta Ways.
And I'm Michael Wiles.
Thank you for joining us. So, Michael, how's it going for you?
I'm good. It's been a great Easter weekend. Got some time to relax and recoup, and the weather has been gorgeous in DC. It's been great. How are you?
Good. I don't know where I've been the last couple of years, but I never remember Easter Sunday. Places are closed. Now that I have a 3-year-old toddler running around in the house, I just struggled today trying to figure out what to do with him. So, and the weather is not that great in Houston. It's just like overcast, muggy, a bit cold. But we managed.
Yeah, here you are.
Barely standing.
So we have a great episode coming up this week. Who's our guest, Shasta?
So our guest this week is Greg Principato. He is the 32nd president and CEO of the National Aeronautics Association, the NAA. So prior to arriving at the NAA, Greg served as president and CEO of the National Association of State Aviation Officials from 2014 to 2016. He has also served as president of ACI, the Airport Council International, the North American sector, from 2005 until 2013, overseeing the leading association of airports and airport-related businesses in North America. He's also worked on policy issues for over 30 years and serving on staffs for U.S. senators like Bennett and Joe Biden. And he's a DC native, just a wealth of knowledge. Every time that we have run into him at conferences or events, he has been nothing but just very warm and kind and hospitable. So it was really a pleasure to have him on.
What a great guy. Greg, over the progression of his career, has clearly worked at the intersection of aviation and policy. And so it was just great to tap into his knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. And also with him being a native from DC, I was really curious to know, what are the natives talking about in terms of aviation? And it's not very different from what we're seeing in the news. So he was just very open, very friendly, and the conversation just gave me a lot to think about.
Great. So let's tune into our conversation with Greg Principato.
Our guest this week on the Uplink podcast is Greg Principato. Greg, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, Greg, you worked on aviation and transportation policy issues for more than 30 years, beginning on the staffs of U.S. senators like Bennett and Joe Biden. Afterwards, you worked with the Clinton administration in the 1990s to help revive the airline industry. And I'm just curious to know, what attracted you to pursue this path over working in the private sector?
Yeah, I love that question because it really, it goes back almost to the beginning of my life. Literally, when I was 4 years old, my parents took me to see JFK running for president. So this is 1960. And so probably many of your listeners will have to Google this. But and so I went, and I mean, I can't tell you what he said that day or anything, but I remember that he was up there. And I remember my parents were enthralled and listening and were inspired. And I remember, I talked to them about it over the next several years, and they talked about how, these are people who can get things done and they have ideas and all the rest of it. And I sort of became a politics and government nerd, I guess. As a kid, when I was 8 years old, I watched political conventions on TV and that kind of thing. But I was just really always attracted to the idea of being able to do something where you can get things done. And as you remember that the 60s were a very newsy decade with the war and civil rights and everything else, and there seemed to be so much to do. And so my original hope was to go into the Foreign Service. And in college, that hope sort of went away when I didn't do so well when I studied Russian. I thought when I was this age, I was going to, right now, I'd be the ambassador to the Soviet Union. that was my career goal when I was in college. I didn't do so well in Russian. I can still order a beer in Russian, pivo pожалуйста, but that's about it. But then I found out that, folks on Capitol Hill had staffs. Who knew? So I wanted to do that. And for 6.5 years, I worked for those senators you talked about. And, I saw things get done. And even as a junior member early, I, worked on things like strategic arms limitation. I worked on reauthorizing the Fair Housing Act, Social Security reform, those things, and aviation and transportation, as you mentioned. And then when I went to work in 1986 for the governor of Virginia, that's really where sort of each career has a pivot. And that was really mine. And we passed a bill that to this day still funds airports throughout Virginia, mostly smaller commercial and general aviation airports. The Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, we worked on the creation of that, bringing more international air service to Dulles Airport. And so, getting things done, it always attracted me, getting things done for a broader purpose. You mentioned the Clinton administration. In 1993, there was a commission. Pan Am, Eastern, and Braniff had gone out of business. McDonnell Douglas was teetering and would be absorbed by Boeing eventually. So the administration and Congress put this commission together to look at why is all this happening. And again, it was a chance to get some things done. And the General Aviation Revitalization Act, for example, would not have been possible without the work we did and get that started. We settled the debate. We're going to talk about regulation later, I think, but settled the debate over whether routes and fares would be re-regulated. A lot of people say, well, the airlines are going out of business because the routes and fares are deregulated. And we're going to talk more about that, I know. But that settled that debate. And people now don't realize that was truly, on the edge. We're going to go back to that, where the government decides what airline can fly to what city and how much they can charge. It also settled the debate and the discussion about open skies air service agreements. We take them for granted today. We have 110 of them. Back then we had one, and it was with the Netherlands, a small country. And people thought, well, this is kind of silly. The Netherlands, they can fly anywhere here and we can fly anywhere in the Netherlands. Where were you going to go? But it was an idea that Jeff Shane from the George H.W. Bush's administration really got going. And it's led to 110 agreements and opened up air service all over the world. And we have competition and more air service to more places all over the world than we ever dreamed about back then. And it settled that debate. So, I always feel like I came to public service for the right reasons. I enjoyed it. I'm happy that I got to be part of it during that time when you can get some things done. And I think we did.
Wow. So I remember when I was doing my master's degree at Embry-Riddle, I did a paper on open skies agreements, and I saw how many there were, and it was so fascinating. So to know that you worked on that just really makes all of that just click in my head and make me admire the work that you guys are doing. So just wanted to share that with you. That's so cool that you worked on that.
Well, there's a lot of pushback at the time too. Jeff Shane, who really should be much better known, was really the architect of all that in George H.W. Bush's administration. A lot of the airlines didn't want it because they had some of the protected routes in some of these places. But
right.
In the end, the pie is bigger for everyone.
It's really fascinating to hear you recount the early parts of your career. We see like a demographic shift where it seems like people of your generation had higher esteem for public service and saw that as sort of something to do earlier in the career. Whereas now you talk to young people, the first thing is, let me get a big tech job. Do you have any thoughts why more young people today in the aviation sector, considering that aviation is so highly regulated, why aren't they pursuing careers in politics or policy more readily? And how do we get those talented people to consider the sector first?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. There were people, I was 4 years old when I saw JFK, but there were people who worked in the Peace Corps back in the 60s. And I remember several interviews with some of those people, and some I got to meet later, and they said, why did you do that? And they said, well, the president asked me to. And it was sort of like that, and people were inspired to do those kind of things. And I do think that it was a time when there were a lot of very basic issues that were, like I said, civil rights and the war in Vietnam and a lot of other things, that were going on. I think that, and in 1973 during Watergate, I remember there was a witness, Gordon Strahan or Gordon Strahan, somebody like that. You can look it up. But they asked him if he would recommend to young people that go into politics and government. He said no. And so this isn't the first time we've had this, right? I think part of the problem is that people think to go into politics and government, you have to be more ideological. Shasta, you mentioned my first boss, J. Bennett Johnston, a great senator, not well known. He loved to play tennis. And so he played tennis with Ted Kennedy. He played tennis with Paul Laxalt, who was Ronald Reagan's best friend in the Senate. He played tennis with everybody. And you get to know each other. It's hard to hate or assign nefarious motives to people if you know their spouse's name, their kid's name, their dog's name. And we don't have that anymore. And I think young people look at politics today and just feel like it's this camp and that camp, and they don't want to get involved in that. I realize I'm talking to two of the smartest younger people I know here, and I may be telling you things you already know, but I really think that's a problem. And so, you see people ascribing these motives, and you feel like you have to go into this camp. And I really believe that expertise is not well valued right now in our politics. Because if I give you a fact that is an undeniable fact, the sky is blue or whatever, you can find somebody who agrees with your worldview who will tell you no, that's false, right? And there's a lack of, I think, respect for expertise. There's a feeling you have to be ideological to go into politics and government. So I think a lot of smart young people are saying, the heck with that. I don't want to fit into that. I want to go do something else. And over here, you got tech jobs or whatever, and things are happening there. Oh, by the way, I can set my own schedule. They have a lot more flexibility, and I can have the kind of lifestyle I want instead of, I have to, be in one place for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week or something, so that they can be flexible. So, I think all those things combined.
Yeah.
So, Greg, there is a recent push to improve the U.S. airports. The current infrastructure bill is setting aside $15 billion to improve airports across the United States, which means that this will be one of the sectors with the highest paying jobs and opportunities. Yet last year, airports couldn't meet the travel demands because they couldn't find workers and facilities needed updating. From your experience as president of the Airport Council International, do you think young professionals know about these career opportunities?
I don't think they do. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I do think, by the way, your comment about airport staffing and the travel problems last year, part of that was from, whether it's controllers or whether it was pilots or whether, all kinds of decisions a lot of people made. Most people don't know that most people who work at an airport don't work for the airport, TSA, or they work for the airline, or they're contractors, or they sell hamburgers or whatever. But, I think airports are not all that well. What they do really isn't all that well known. They're a building and runway, and that's all people think they are. And I do think, frankly, I know I'm talking to a very prominent pilot here, but I think pilots and other people in aviation sort of look at airports as, well, you're not part of what we do. You're different. Nobody can fly an airport anyplace. And so I think it gets downgraded a little bit. And I also think that airports don't do a good job of telling their story. I remember when I took over at Airports Council International North America in 2005, and we were talking about the passenger facility charge, which helps build facilities and stuff. And so why don't you tell people what you use their PFC for? And he said, well, we don't want them really necessarily to know, and that kind of thing. I think part of that comes from that in this country, and I want to talk about this a little bit more later, but that airports are part of the public sector. And so, I've got a mayor, I've got a county executive, I've got a governor, somebody looking over my shoulder. And so, I think that that keeps people from talking a little bit more about what airports do. But I really think, as I look at, my kids are in their 30s, my stepkids are, ending high school and in college, right? And what are people in those generations looking for? And one of the things they're looking for is a more diverse workforce and more inclusive. Now, all of aviation has a long way to go, and you can probably do a day-long podcast on that. But the airport sector, compared to commercial airline pilots or mechanics or a lot of other folks, pretty diverse overall. I know a number of great women and people of color and others who run airports and who are high-ranking executives in airports, and it's always been the case since I've been involved in it. So while it's not as good as it can be, it's better than a lot of other places. And I would think for a smart young person working in an airport can be a really great start to a career, and I think a really great career. So, I tried to get some of that word out when I was at ACI. I know my successor has kept it up, and we have decades of being overlooked to overcome. But I think that's I think you're right. I think it's a great career opportunity, and I hope that people will take it seriously.
That's a great observation. Recently at Dreams4, we just announced our next chapter, and part of our goal is to help young people discover all the available roles in the industry. And when we were putting together or just doing our research, we saw that there were about 860 plus jobs that are directly or indirectly in the aviation sector. But when you say you work in aviation to someone, they immediately think of pilots and mechanics.
Right.
And we realized we needed to reshape the narrative to say to people, whatever your passion is, you could actually apply it to aviation. So if you enjoy tech or logistics or whatever, it can apply to the aviation industry. And I think, communicating that to people who like infrastructure and civil engineering, they could see that airports are a fascinating place to work as well.
I think so, and I know like the Women in Aviation Advisory Board, for example, pointed out there are 53 job categories through 8 career fields in aviation. And that may be understated. I remember Catherine Creedy writing an article about animal and people who love animals. And whether it's FedEx or any, when you're transporting animals, you need someone, you can't just have somebody off the street just say, hey, get in here. You need people who are trained for that, right? And so there are so many things you can do in aviation. One of the old jokes in aviation is the guy who empties the honey bucket. Probably don't have to explain to you all what that is, or to your listeners. And, it stinks and everything else, right? And he goes to his doctor, and the doctor's saying, you look like you've aged or whatever. And what's going on? I'm working really hard, and you stink too. What's going on? And he said, well, I empty the honey bucket, and explains to the doctor what that is. And the doctor says, why don't you leave that? And the guy said, what, and leave aviation? No.
Wow.
So once you get in, right, it's a field that tends to grab you once you're in, but we need to do a better job of getting people in across the board.
We know that the airline industry is one of the 10 most regulated industries in the US. And when you combine it with some of its related sectors like oil and gas and power generation and manufacturing, it's sort of cumulatively one of the top 3 regulated industries. But there's a study that shows that heavy regulation reduces entrepreneurship, employment opportunities, investment, and slower productivity. In the last few years, we've seen an uptick in people wanting to invest in the space. There's these SAF mandates, and then there's a push for EV tolls and all of these things. You think, as an industry, to recognize these gains, do we need to be more or less regulated?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. So, I talked before about how routes and fares used to be regulated, and to this day, among some people, there's still a view that deregulating those things ruined the industry, right? But back in those days, only 1 in 9 routes even had 2 airlines on it. This is 1978 when the industry was deregulated. And now only about 10% of routes don't have any competition at all, right? people don't realize that back then it was people like Ted Kennedy and Ralph Nader who were pushing hardest for routes and fares to be deregulated. Um, it started in the Ford administration with John Robson, and then Fred Kahn in the Carter administration. So, the the economics of the airline business, certainly the commercial aviation business, are really pretty deregulated. I do think people demand that the safety and security part be regulated, right? And I'm not sure how much of that you could deregulate without, to increase, entrepreneurship or investment or whatever, without losing public support. And, these new technologies, eVTOL and all that, and, wanting to fly people maybe with a remote pilot. You get into a vehicle and there's nobody in the vehicle has a uniform on or anything. And, it's going to be hard to convince the public to get into that unless it's pretty well regulated. What happened in safety regulation is one of the most amazing stories, I think, in American governmental and industrial history. When you think back in the early 90s, just go back and look and see the accidents and so forth that were happening then. I remember Dave Henson, the FAA administrator, saying we're on a pace to have around the world a major hull loss accident every other week of the entire year, right? That's the pace. And that all changed, the crew resource management and a lot of those things that happened, pilots being able to share information without fear of coming back to bite them or whatever, but they know something happened. We learn from each thing. And I don't think the public is going to stand for any of that to be deregulated. And I don't think the public or the policymakers are going to stand for any of the security stuff being deregulated. So with the routes and fares and all those things already deregulated, with, if an airport accepts public money, you've got to, whether it's, the plane that Shasta flew around the world, or whether it's an A380 that might come in, you have to let that plane use your airport in this country. It's still pretty open. So I don't see that. I don't see that changing. I do think one area that there's more room for public investment and maybe could be deregulated a little bit is on the airport side. You look at, there was a little bit more, private involvement at the Port Authority with, LaGuardia and Newark and now JFK. And I went through LaGuardia a few weeks ago. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So I would like to see more public-private partnerships in the airport side, not just in new construction, but also in the running of the airports. I think that there is room for a deregulated regime for airports in this country, where they have a little more freedom to charge, different times of the day. Again, using the example I used before, whether it's an A380 with 400 people in it, or Shasta, whether it's your plane that you took around the world, they use it using the runway the same, right? It's you land. And so airports being able to regulate that a little bit better on their own, I think would be helpful to everyone. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, and it seems and there's a big trend on TikTok right now about what to do if your airline screws you over, and consumers themselves are almost demanding regulation for consumer protection. You get on a flight and the airline cancels the flight because they can't find any pilots. Should you get a hotel or not, or what sort of points. And so there's this one person on TikTok, she's giving you all the cues of what to say if they say, we need someone to give up our seats.
It's become a whole industry, right? And Europe, the rules and regulations are much more consumer friendly than they are here, for that kind of thing. I think it was the time a few years ago when the poor fellow got dragged off the United flight by the I think the airport police folks or whoever it was all bloody and everything, got people's attention. So there's really a cottage industry with that, and that is one of those things. By the way, you asked about airports earlier. In the old days when that happened, when I was 25 years old or something, the airline had to give you a place to stay and some food and everything. Now it's okay, you're on your own. And so you're there at the airport. So the airport, airports now have cots and blankets, and many of them require at least one concessionaire to remain open, well into the night so that people can get food. When I was at ACI, there was a plane that was stuck out on the tarmac for hours, and there was a whole couple of groups that formed out of that. Flyers Rights, I think .org is one of them, and so forth. They're really pushing for those kinds of things. Why can't we get food? Why can't you have to let us off? So we have done some more regulation in that area. Excuse me, I just hit my table. Some more regulation in that area. But I think in terms of, back to your original question, deregulating and make it more entrepreneurial, I'm not really sure how you would do that, except maybe, like I said, in the space of how you run an airport. I think if we can have a little less, public sector involvement in some of that, and a little more public-private partnership in the actual running of airports, especially larger airports, I think that would be a good thing.
That was a great observation, Greg. Thank you for sharing all of those insights. You gave me a lot to think about, things that I didn't think about before. So, Greg, you're from DC, and DC could be considered aviation's Silicon Valley. And when we see the headlines like the search for a new FAA administrator and the FAA reauthorization bill, it's on the news all the time. It's on Twitter. It's on, it's everywhere. But what is actually happening? Like, I'm curious to know, what are the DC natives talking about?
Well, I think in the bigger picture, it's always election year. So they're already starting to talk about the presidential and those kind of things, of course. The news of last week about the former president, has got a lot of people talking, of course. So in the bigger picture, those things and bigger issues like Ukraine and so forth. In terms of aviation, well, you mentioned a couple of things that fit into the sort of scorekeeping part. Who's up, who's down for FAA administrator, and a lot of speculation about that. And with FAA reauthorization coming up, everybody is trying to get their issue into that bill. I remember when I was working for Senator Biden in 1982, the reauthorization bill came up. It had already been hashed out in committee, in the Commerce Committee. All the fights had been had. It came up on the floor. Most of the time was yielded back, and it passed, either unanimously or by a voice vote. That's just the way it was. When I was at ACI North America, the bill was expiring, I think, in 2007 or 8. We had 4.5 years and 23 extensions. And, 1 year it couldn't get, it had momentum, and then somebody brought up abortion, somebody brought up an education issue, and then that just stopped it right there. So everybody's trying to figure out how that's going to play out this year, trying to get their issues into it without, muddying the waters too much. I do think right now the big one of the big issues is the safety issue. A lot of runway incursions have happened. People. At first, I thought maybe it was slow. It's slow news right now, right? So maybe each one, and I do think things get reported now that wouldn't have been reported 30 years ago. But some folks I really trust say, no, things are really happening more often. And I remember in the about 2007 or 8, when Marianne Blakey was the FAA administrator, she made runway incursions and excursions a big issue. And I remember testifying on that on Capitol Hill. And so I don't know if that's an issue that comes and goes, but there's a lot of focus on that now because I think people want to know that they're safe. Getting back to your regulation question earlier, so I think that's a big aviation issue right now that policymakers are really focused on.
It sounds like with the reauthorization bill, a lot is at stake. When you think about the new technologies that have marketed themselves to come online soon, all the eVTOLs, they said they're gonna launch in 2025, and you have all the stuff with the SAF and then the workforce. So it sounds like, as you're saying, there are a lot of groups that will on either sides will be pushing for those things or trying to protect the status quo.
Yeah, how will those things be regulated? How do you fold them into the airspace? There's a lot of things. I mean, I'm sitting in Dayton, Ohio right now, and if I want to fly out of CVG, which I do like to fly out of, I do like to fly out of Dayton too, but it's a long trip. But an eVTOL type situation, you can go over not far from here maybe and grab one and be down there and in 15 minutes rather than having to go over, as President Biden called it, that damn bridge, to get from Ohio into Kentucky. So, I think there's a role for all these things. And I'm not sure we have the policy framework. So this is one of those years where the reauthorization and what follows, and the regulations that follow out of it, demand a lot of expertise. And I think we have it on hand. And I'm hoping, back to one of your earlier questions, that those kind of things will inspire younger people to take another look at aviation, because this is new, right? A slightly bigger plane or slightly quieter plane doesn't really grab their attention, but this is new stuff. And I'm hoping it'll grab their attention.
So, Greg, what's next for you? I'm curious. I know you announced your retirement. What do you have planned in the next coming months or even year?
Hopefully years, many years, hopefully. Well, I've still got about 5 months to go, finishing up here. They've chosen an amazing successor for me, and she's going to take NAA to ridiculously new, wonderful heights. Amy Spowert. So I'll be, supporting her any way I can, of course. I'm on a museum board, National Children's Museum. I'll continue that and maybe look for another board or two, or a research project or something. I'd love to give presentations to students, college students, about some of the things we talked about. Aviation is, you said it before, a regulated, political, policy-driven industry that, I remember one consultant saying, people graduate from these colleges to run airports, and they don't find out till they get the job later that it's a political job too. They have to put up with not just the politics, the usual junk, but, dealing with the community, dealing with the press, and then, all those things. So I'd like to be able to do some of that and talk about some of that. And I want to travel. There are lots of places to go. I've been to 47 countries in my life, and I want to, add. I love going to them, and whether it's for work or pleasure, and actually being there, and not just saying, okay, I see, the Eiffel Tower is over there, and Notre Dame's over there. Okay, Paris is done. Let's go to London. There's Big Ben. There's Houses of Parliament. Let's go. I want to actually experience, places. So we spent a month in Italy earlier this year, and would love to do more of that.
Any book in the future?
I read lots of books.
Sounds like you have a book to write.
I don't know. I started one once, more of a policy book with a former boss, Jerry Baliles, who was the governor of Virginia I talked about before. It's hard to do. So I don't know about that, but I do like to read. I've got a lot of books I want to read.
Greg, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us and sharing all of these incredible insights and information. It's been wonderful. Thank you for making the time for us.
Thank you both for having me. You're two of my favorite people in aviation, and when you offered me the chance to chat with you, couldn't say no. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It was rich. Thank you so much.
So really, as I said, in our conversation, he gave me a lot to think about, a lot of different points that I didn't consider before, especially with just all of the investments that are being made at airports and just the job opportunities that are available. Just such a great guy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's just interesting, as I said earlier, to tap into someone who works in aviation and policy and politics, and just to see what that career path could look like. And, we often take for granted how important or how prominent politics plays in our industry. Aviation is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world, and we actually need more young people to consider career paths in that sector, because the benefits that we enjoy now come from just policy, good policy. They're policies that have kept us safe and made our life better. So it was just so great to hear from Greg.
I think it was you who told me, Scott Galloway made a comment about how, why do we not have the most talented people working in the policy space? Because that affects everybody in America. Not to say those who are in politics are not the brightest, but it is competitive, where a lot of the smart intelligent people are going to other sectors like tech and so on for the money, but we really need that talent to be in government.
Yeah. And I think, in this time that we're in where, the world seems to be divided, and certainly in America, things seem to be divided. If people had to sort of spend some time serving their country, we could sort of weave together a more common thread.
Yeah.
If the best and brightest people, instead of immediately going into high paying tech jobs, could serve their country and sort of advance things, I think we would all be better off. So again, hopefully more people will consider career paths in the policy space.
That was well said, Michael.
So Shasta, what's going on in the news this week?
Nothing striking. I just wanted us to go back to something that was happening since the beginning of this year. We kind of brushed on it in our last episode, but in the United States, we're seeing a lot of near misses in aviation.
What do you think is going on? Why are we seeing a proliferation of incidents?
I don't know why, but I can tell you in terms of, this year, we kind of started off, it was very prominent in the news on January 13th. American Airlines, one of their jets crossed a runway at New York's JFK International Airport as Delta Airlines was taking off. And I know that made the headlines. And then only 10 days later, a United Airlines aircraft at Honolulu International Airport was on the runway and a cargo aircraft was coming in to land. It was a near miss. I think the aircraft were, just shy of 1,000 feet apart. And then, shortly after in February, there were another series of incidents. In Austin, Texas, FedEx cargo pilots were landing to see Southwest on the runway, getting ready to take off. So all of these near misses kind of led to the FAA hosting a safety summit. And during the summit, Secretary Pete Buttigieg cited that there was an uptick in these incidents. The safety summit was just really there for them to talk about all of these near misses and just making everyone a bit more aware.
Shasta, I want to play devil's advocate for a little bit. Are there really more near misses, or is social media and the news cycle amplifying, what's just been sort of happening, especially since, the holiday season was one where aviation was in the spotlight because of that winter storm, and then Southwest Airlines had its meltdown, and then the NODEM issue. It seems like the media, outside aviation media, sort of latches on at times to aviation stories and try to, when there's one incident, take it and try to amplify it. Even though if you look at the data, we actually haven't had more near misses.
This is interesting, Michael, because it may be true. We do have more social media, we have more awareness. But although the data does indicate that, we have somewhat of a consistent number of incidences, I think it's never been this bad. And it's specifically within the airlines. And I think that that's really powerful because when you look at the scale of these incidences and these near misses, you're looking at hundreds of lives. And so I think it could be that there is more social media, but regardless, it's just very scary to see this.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wouldn't want to minimize the risk or what is at stake. I just also am cautious about how things are being covered. And because when we look at the FAA's safety statistics, even though runway incursions aren't necessarily near misses, when you look at, for instance, the first quarter of 2023, so far the FAA has recorded 365 runway incursions. But when compared to the first quarter of 2022, when, if you think about it, was sort of a ramp-up year from the pandemic, there were 401 runway incursions, which means that there so far this year has been fewer runway incursions than there were last year, which sort of just makes me think that the news cycle is amplifying pilots messing up. However, not to take away, and I totally agree with what you're saying, there is a lot of at stake. And at this point, pilots need to be really vigilant.
Of course, it's not just one thing. It's, the pilot, maybe it's just the flight deck environment. Maybe it's just the way that the company does things. I say this because I had a good friend of mine. We had a discussion recently about, he works for an airline in the US, a major airline. And he was saying how when they push back from the gate and they start, starting the engines, he said that it's just such an intense moment in terms of workload. There's like the captain is the one who's taxiing, the first officer is the one who's doing checklist items and, doing the checklist. And he was saying that there were several instances where like he was just extremely overwhelmed and stressed because there was just a lot going on, and the captain almost turned the wrong way or almost turned into an active runway. And so he was making these comments about how during the taxi phase, there should be no checklist. It should just be focus, heads looking out, focus on just making sure that they're not going to run into anything or take off from the wrong runway or, any of these near misses that we're reading about. So like, I'm wondering, is this something that the airlines need to kind of investigate and make sure that what they have implemented during that phase when these aircraft are taxiing, that, they're able to fully focus?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, again, with the new cycle, now you might see airline management, flight operation departments reinforce the pilots, be vigilant, be aware of what's going on. It's not just what's inside your airplane, but, consider just what might be also happening outside your airplane. And don't trust the system. That's one thing I've learned as a pilot myself, where, there's time when air traffic controllers, when they are dealing with a high load, have issued incorrect taxi instructions to me. And I know what they're trying to say based on the flow of traffic. And so if I were to just blindly read back an incorrect instruction, I would have ended up in the wrong too. And so pilots also have that duty to just be really situationally aware, to also help the system.
All great points, Michael. We hope that this conversation is going to encourage you all to have that dialogue with one another, because safety is a responsibility of everyone in the industry. And so I feel like the more we can talk about it and bring awareness and be critical and have discussions, can only go up from here.
Well, this was a great conversation this week, Shasta. Looking forward to next week.
Me too. Thank you all for tuning in.